Okay, thank you. You've heard from the gurus about nematodes and tolerance. We're going to be concentrating here on very much on susceptibility and resistance and the impact of the decisions you make on a rotation as to what you can do with those numbers. So again, as we indicated before, we'll be concentrating very much on thornei. Pratylenchus thornei, it's the main culprit for this part of the world. So how do you start to develop a rotation? How do you get a system in place? Where do you start? Really, as we alluded to, if you're at a point where you don't know, where you got to test and know what your enemy is. You just got to get the test done. You just got to know what the starting point is. If you're going to monitor it from there, you've got to know what it is right from the start. The other thing you've got to work in, and it depends geographically where you are, is what's the winter to summer ratio of crops that you're going to grow. We heard pretty much before that a lot of the summer crops are inherently resistant, and in those parts of the world, the thornei numbers will be low. As we'll get onto later, we'll see that the neglectus numbers might be slightly elevated in some crops, in some summer crops, but usually it's a system that will often, as Kirsty indicated, you've got two resistant crops in a rotation, that will drive numbers down. In this part of the world where it's about 80% winter crop, we've got to be really careful. As we go further west, where the winter crop percentage goes up, again, we've got to be careful, and the same to the south. So, and within that rotation, what's the pillar crop? What's your main focus in a rotation? Are you a wheat grower? Are you a cotton grower? Are you really concentrating on chickpeas in your rotation? Do you like chickpeas in your system? And do you want to sort of have that as your main focus? So decide what the pillar is and what the driver is of your rotation. And then after that, once you've worked out how it's all going to work, then you really got to look at the crops and the varieties according to the nematode resistance. So resistance, we've heard, and we've really got to understand this, the difference between resistance and tolerance. Resistance is what's happening with the numbers, what you can do to manipulate those numbers. Tolerance, and we've heard a lot of work from what Kirsty was saying before, is that's all the yield result. The tolerance is the yield result. The resistance, susceptibility, is what those little guys are doing in your field. And you've got to understand the impact of both of those. And there are excellent guides, fantastic guides for nematodes on resistance and tolerance. It's two separate columns. Also understand the impact of the crops that you're choosing. Obviously the dollars, if mung beans are $1,500 a tonne, you're going to be more inclined to grow them. So you've got to understand if dollars become an impact or have a driver for what's in your rotation, understand what it does to these numbers up here. And crown rot, of course. So we're going to talk about predictability, and we're going to talk about the interaction of nematodes with crown rot. And the good thing about it is that we can test both in the one test. We can get a result back so long as we get the protocols right, as Steve was indicating. Test the paddock. I just want to clarify one thing. Steve was saying if you're going to do a soil test, well, it's not really relevant for testing nematodes. But the little cores that we'll have and the cores that you use are only like a 10 mil core. So when you go and put your hole in, when you go and take your soil test, you can take 6 or 8 small cores around it and tip that in. And again, if you want to get crown rot, if you want to make sure you want to pick crown rot up, do it in the row. Do it in the old stubble row. It won't have much impact on the nematode numbers, but for crown rot, do it in the row. And also, to make sure you get a positive, or if you want to know whether there's really crown rot there, put those spikes in. But the protocols are written out with it. So you can do it when soil testing, but don't use the core itself. Go and do the little subsamples around. Put them in the bag. I won't go through this. We've heard all that. That's the result you get back. Now these numbers here from the predictor B, they're per gram a lot of what Kirsty was saying before, a lot of what John's work has been done, the fantastic work he's done over the years, is per kilogram. So multiply that by 1,000. So greater than 15 is per gram, which is 15,000 per kilogram. So if you're looking at old references, that's the link. Just multiply the predictability number by 1,000. And you can see here, intolerant varieties, even when we got what is classified at the moment as a low number, you get the wrong circumstance, 5 to 30% loss. And it's interesting here, there's about 40% of the tests that we did through Crown that have coming back as medium or high. And if you've got the wrong variety, you know, there's 10 to 80% loss. Maybe that's contributing to what Zvi Hockman was talking about this morning with that yield gap. And there's probably no coincidence that varieties like Baxter and Sunvale have been successful. Clearly outclassed in a lot of the NVT trials, but hugely successful out in the field because they've got good tolerance to Pratylenchus thornei. Baxter at Mungandai is a very hard variety to toss. I'm sure that's no coincidence. Okay, this is just a snapshot of the bag. So the predictability bag that you'll get, and it's been, so Sadi have developed this one for the north. So it's a northern test, and it does these 6 pathogens: thornei, neglectus, so the 2 Pratylenchus, crown rot. These are what they call the underdevelopment, but they're really, it means they're getting the numbers. They've just got to work on on their thresholds. Crown rot, Pythium, Rhizoctonia, and common root rot. And in future, I mean, the GRDC are putting some good investment behind predictability. Hopefully, we'll have Phytophthora for chickpeas. So that's going to be it's going to be a pretty useful added test. That's just the back page of it. We've done that. I'll just concentrate on this page for a little bit. Understand the impact of the crop choice. So we've heard this morning that wheat, that probably should be susceptible. Susceptible is susceptible. They will multiply the Pratylenchus thornei numbers. So these ones here are thornei, these ones here are neglectus. So wheat and chickpeas, favour beans, mung beans. And we also heard soybeans as another crop. Crops that will, I've got here reduce, but it's probably not multiply. It's probably just flatline and maintain the status quo. Or if grown in succession, or a number of these, then they can reduce it. But canola, canary, durum, linseed. Durum, that's debatable. That's probably a mid-runner. It certainly wouldn't reduce it. I would contest it. It wouldn't reduce it. But cotton, sorghum, sunflower, millet. One question, Steve, might be with cotton and sorghum is, does double skip work as well as single skip or solid? I mean, that's probably another research project. But you'll notice here that canola and sorghum will reduce thornei, but will actually exacerbate neglectus. So if you swing up into a summer dominant or a canola dominant rotation, then you've got to be careful that you're not just replacing one with the other. So that's where the monitoring comes in. And you notice here the converse is favour beans. Thornei numbers down, thornei numbers up, neglectus numbers down. Varietal differences, it's mainly chickpeas and wheat that you've got to be careful of in the varietal choice, and especially wheat, as we saw. From a tolerance and yield point of view, we saw that 30 to 80, potentially 80% yield loss, but also the wrong choice of variety from a resistance and a rotation point of view can multiply the nematode numbers by tenfold. Up at Richard Daniel and NGA up at the Yalleroy site showed that with Strzelecki, it took the numbers from 2,000 to 20,000. A resistant variety sort of flat lined across or increased slightly. So be very careful on choice. Chickpeas to an extent, can double the numbers. So choose wisely. John, just to finish off with, I've just got here some examples of rotations in different parts of the world. So again, we're combating Pratylenchus thornei. We're using sorghum in the system, and this is probably a pretty typical rotation in round Moree. So we're going from growing wheat, so into barley, which is reasonably common, long fallowing that into sorghum, double cropping back into chickpeas and around. Now, what impact would this have on Pratylenchus thornei? That would probably maintain it, and it would be very important to choose that variety, that resistant, an MR/MS variety, carefully. And we know Kirsty went through a list of about 8 varieties which are the best. Barley may exacerbate it, bring it up. Long fallow sorghum should bring it down or flatline it. Chickpeas, so long as they're a variety like Hat-Trick are probably the best to not blow the numbers out. There are varieties that will blow them out. Kyabra, Jimbor seem to be ones that will increase it. So that is, you would think, as close to sustainable, you know, and a lot of that is driven by the crown rot cycle too, because you've got 2 break crops for crown rot. So if you're taking crown rot out and nematode numbers aren't exploding, then you can work with that. When you do the test is probably a matter of, that might just, if you just on a monitoring basis, you might, you can really do it anywhere. You might come in at the point where you think it might be the highest. So it might be coming in after chickpeas, for instance, or might be coming in after barley before you do the long fallow. But if you don't know where it is, you don't know what the numbers are for a start, you probably come in and maybe test before you grow that wheat. So if we're using cotton, here's where, you know, wheat, I've got here wheat, canola, wheat. You know, again, this is on the eastern side, long fallow to cotton and back to millet. So they're 2 break crops. So that could be reasonably effective. Well, it's actually 3. You got 3 break crops, and if they were as good as you can get, you know, be it a Wiley or a Gauntlet or a Burke or whatever, you would not expect the numbers to get away there at all. The one downside of that is would be you've got to be careful with crown rot, and if you introduce durum in here and you've got a mandatory cultivation and you're going in here with a level of crown rot, then you've got to be really careful with that crop because it can get smashed. There's a lot of Gregory planted there into long fallow cotton. If they didn't know what this number here of inoculum was going in, a lot of Gregory there has been badly damaged by crown rot. So this is just the western stuff where you've got a high, you're forced to have more winter crop, and you just got to be more careful in the choice of these varieties. I mean, you really only got canola and cotton is a potential long shot where you're long fallowing in and long fallowing out. So the choice of all of these 4 is absolutely critical not to get nematode numbers away. If you're on the downs in the Liverpool Plains where you've got sorghum, say double cropping it to chickpeas, and they grow a lot of durum. Durum's relatively good. It's an MR, is it? An MR for MR and MS, MR/MS. So it's pretty good. Those are good, of course. And if that was Hat-Trick, then the thornei numbers might not be a problem, but you'd have to be careful over time. You actually want to monitor as much for neglectus, because these ones here, the 2 sorghums can increase the neglectus numbers. So the last thing was clearly understand in your own mind the difference between the tolerance and resistance. Tolerance is yield. Resistance susceptibility is what it's doing to the numbers. Rotations are very hard to stick to. We know that now. We're all throwing our hands up in the air and going, what are we going to do? Because, you know, if we only plant 30% of our area, we might be long fallowing stuff right through for next year. It's just going to throw our rotations into turmoil. So you just need to establish your own basic rules and sequences and try to stick to it as much as possible and understand the consequences on the ramifications of your decision. Avoid the suckers and monitor.